Today I'm speaking with Tiffani Cappello. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
And just to give a brief bio, Tiffani Cappello is a women's empowerment coach, a clinical hypnotherapist, and a rapid transformational therapist, which I want to ask about in a second. She also runs a Facebook group called Transformed Women and another one called Former Fundamentalists. She also runs something called Transformed Women Academy, which helps women to address trauma and negative patterns and self-talk so that they can remove toxic stress and find true happiness and empower people basically to do self-directed healing as well in all that. And she also has 6 children, which is amazing that you can do all the things you do with that many kids. And you do, I'm sure, a lot of other things, but could you tell us what I'm missing there? What else do you do professionally, and what else you do on the side for your hobbies, and how do you do it all with 6 kids?
Well, I only have 2 kids still at home.
Okay.
But you know, when you have 6 kids, you still got to be a part of your adult children's lives. So, and my kids are all wonderful, and that really helps. So, so I have my own private practice in Chesterland, Ohio. I work mostly by Zoom now because of COVID. And I basically, if you think about it, the problem with being involved in religious groups is that the beliefs are toxic. And it's not just people in religious groups that have beliefs that are keeping them unhappy, holding them down, blocking them from success, causing depression, anxiety. It's a lot of people out there. So basically, I help people to overcome that. So I do one-on-one coaching. I have an online program called The Transform Life. And I do Rapid Transformational Therapy, which is amazing. It was designed by famed British therapist Marissa Peer, who I work for and with. And it's basically using hypnosis and NLP. It helps the individual identify where their negative patterns, say anxiety or depression, came from. Because these things, we're not born with anxiety or depression. It's programmed in, just like religious cults and religion can program in beliefs that aren't reality. Often dysfunctional childhood upbringings, school bullies, and negative adults in our life, trauma, can program in beliefs about ourselves and the world that end up affecting us throughout our lives. So I help to identify that, reframe it for the subconscious mind, and then help the client adopt new empowering beliefs.
What does NLP stand for, by the way?
Neuro-linguistic programming. So it's a big word to basically say we are helping you shift within the subconscious mind. Because the subconscious mind is where all of our learned behaviors are stored. It's not a specific place in the brain. It's just more of a concept. So once you learn to drive a car, it's stored in the subconscious mind. So you could drive to the store or to work and think about what you're going to have for dinner, who you're going to meet for lunch. Now, when you first learned to drive a car, you had to sit and carefully think about, okay, I got to turn on my turn signal. I got to stop here. I got to, not press my foot on the wrong pedal. But once it's learned, it's in there. Well, it's great for driving a car, but the problem is we often learn destructive thought patterns and behaviors that at the time they're coping mechanisms as children. Maybe because we're in a toxic religious group or a dysfunctional family. And as we become adults, they're no longer functional, but we're still carrying out these well-learned behaviors. So it's important to identify these patterns that are no longer serving us and move past them. So that's what I do with RTT. And the amazing thing is I do 1 3-hour session, and boom, 90% of my clients don't need a second session for the issue they came in for. So
working yourself out of a job. Do you mind my asking what is the typical issue in terms of categories? Like, are most people concerned about religious background issues, like toxic religious issues? Is it more relational, or is it just a whole mix of situations?
I work mostly with anxiety, depression, confidence issues, but it's amazing because as we take a look into the client's past, even clients that don't think religion was an issue, it often is. It's one of the most influential things in our lives, and it's the way we are often programmed. So, the mind is basically programmable. It's kind of born a pretty blank slate in infancy, and then everything you learn gets stored in there. If you learn love and acceptance and reasoning and logical skills, you're in a pretty good place. If you learn self-denigration and worthlessness and unlovableness and you're not enough as you are, and all these things that religion often teaches us, that's going to affect your relationships, your life. It's going to affect you on every level, even things we don't usually associate, like our career.
Yeah, it becomes your world, part of your worldview. Could I ask some of these things I want to get right back into in a minute, but could you tell us, like, as we talk about religion, where did you come from with religion? Were you, I assume, in a Christian family of some sort when you grew up?
Actually, I wasn't.
Okay.
Mom was an alcoholic, is an alcoholic still to this day. So there was a lot of early developmental trauma around that dynamic. So when I got to be an adult in my late teens, early 20s, and I met somebody, I got married, and my big concern was, now what do I do? Because I didn't feel like I think because the world sends you a message, particularly during that era of, if you had a dysfunctional family, you're broken. So I had this mentality that I was broken, and I had delved enough into religion to really have embraced the belief that I was a broken human and I needed God to fix me, because I was born a sinner, which is basically saying you're born bad, rotten, defective.
Well, could I ask, where did you first hear that? Was that when you were a little bit, into marriage, or did you ever hear that as a young person?
I can't really pinpoint that too well. If you think about it, was sort of the theme of our American society for, during the colonial period and beyond. It was the authoritarian way of parenting and viewing the world. I can't really, honestly, my dad and my stepmother, who raised me from the age of probably about 8 onward, it's definitely never anything they said. You're not enough, you're broken, you need Jesus to be saved. Nothing.
That's good.
I think because I fundamentally felt that way, and maybe it was something that was brought on by, early developmental trauma, will leave a person with a very low sense of self-worth to begin with. I became a magnet for religion in the more extreme form, not a healthy type of spirituality based on love, but an unhealthy spirituality, which is based on fear and shame and guilt, which is something, if you've had a lot of developmental trauma in your life, you're going to have a tendency to gravitate towards, not always, but a lot of times. So I'm becoming an adult. What I wanted more than anything else in the world, and it's something I'm even exploring now because I'm always working towards healing and becoming better, even though I'm helping others, is that, I never really felt safe and loved. It's really hard to do in an alcoholic home when you're very tiny and your protector has an issue like an addiction. And so I had this great need to feel safe and loved, to feel okay, to feel like I matter. And I wanted that family that I never had. And I wouldn't say it's because my dad and stepmom didn't try to give me a family, but there was this void in those early years. So I wanted to have this wonderful family. And I thought to myself, now, how can I be a really good mom? I felt inept at that because of my own mom. And so I thought, I know just what I'll do. I'll find out what God says about, right? I mean, if you believe in God, that's what you think. Who knows better than the guy who created me, right?
Right.
So I started looking in, and I wanted strong moral values. I wanted my marriage to last. And to me, I had this vision that this was the path that would lead to a long-lasting marriage. It would lead to me being a good moral person because I felt bad and broken. Uh, so I started seeking religion probably in late junior high, early high school. And probably not in a very healthy way, because I remember my parents, my stepmom, my dad, becoming concerned from time to time about my religious exploration. So they were already thinking, maybe this isn't so healthy. And they tried to kind of steer me in the right direction, but I was being driven by that inward void, I think.
Was the concern that you were going into too many religions, or just that you were going too narrow-mindedly into one?
Oh, well, I seem to gravitate towards unhealthy religious views, and they weren't real religious, but I think they just picked up on that this doesn't seem like a healthy path for her. And when I left their home, met my ex-husband and got married, I had the freedom to explore whatever I wanted. Not that they restricted that freedom, but you kind of don't want to displease your parents. So having that freedom, I began to just read and explore. And I came to believe, because I was taught that the Bible was the inerrant, infallible word of God. So I'm like, okay, this is awesome. Now I have this book that will tell me everything I need to think and do. And I don't, and all truth is found therein on these pages. Except the problem is I have a very high IQ. So even back in those early days, you're reading through it and you're going, I found the more I read, the more anxious I got, because I saw things very black and white. If the Bible is inerrant and infallible, and not metaphorical, then I've got to look honestly at its pages. I'm not a dishonest person. I was never good at fooling myself into seeing two opposite perspectives and somehow being able to mesh them. Like, God is good and loving, but he kills people just because he gets a little pissed about something minor they probably did on accident. Like you see in the Old Testament, they reached out to study the Ark of the Covenant because it was going to fall, right? Boom, that strikes him dead. Okay. Well, any of the arguments of God being loving and merciful, despite his behavior demonstrating otherwise, it was really difficult for me to mesh that. And then you go for spiritual guidance and you're told, well, the problem is with you, not God. The more I tried to reconcile these opposing viewpoints and these strange perspectives, the more difficult it became. And cognitive dissonance is a very uncomfortable psychological place to be.
I love, by the way, how you talked a couple of times in this so far about just what you gravitated towards, the idea of a magnet. I think you even used that word. And it's interesting how I haven't thought about that side of it. I see it more on the side of, the spiritual leaders who are, con artists and deceiving people or withholding information to help people make a good decision. And the fault, the liability, culpability of people doing the deceiving. But it's interesting bringing the other side to it, like you're saying, of the ways that certain personality types might tend to certain to groups. Certain, like maybe some people might get really sucked into a more of a mystical, esoteric, new agey kind of spiritualism. Other people, it's more like, I want the black and white. I want the I don't want the gray areas. I want the fundamentalism. And it's an interesting part of that. I hadn't thought too much about it, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, it's interesting because the final church that I ended up in I kind of gravitated and explored many of the groups were very cultic. I would consider a good portion of mainstream Christianity to be very cultic. So as I'm gravitating through, I ended up in an IFB church. It was very, very cultic and very small.
Just for everyone else, what does that stand for?
Independent Fundamental Baptist.
Gotcha. And I know a lot of people who might watch my show might know what that means, but just for anyone who doesn't, could you tell us just a little bit, a quick summary of what that might mean to people that would go to a church like that?
Well, the independent fundamental Baptists believe their main premise is the Bible in the King James Version is the inerrant, infallible Word of God. It's to be taken very literally and obeyed explicitly. And generally speaking, most of the churches believe that anyone outside the IFB is either not really a Christian or they're serving a corrupt version of Christianity. So they're way more conservative than your typical Baptist. So often, not always, the women will wear dresses, and there's a lot of homeschooling, or they typically don't send their kids to public school. They're going to send their kids to their own Baptist school, or they're going to homeschool them. They're going to be opposed a lot to television, social media, anything that would, what they consider, indoctrinate you, but would really pull you away from the indoctrination process that they have going on there.
They really shelter you. I didn't grow up Baptist, but I had a lot of Baptist family and friends. And my freshman year of college, I went to a school called Bob Jones University. Are you familiar with Bob Jones?
Very, very familiar with that.
Yes, and I don't know the actual numbers, but I would guess it's 95% Baptist or something like that, or at least Baptistic, and very much along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, and I'm looking back at it, I don't see the leadership of the church as being deliberately manipulative. My pastor believed strongly in everything he said and did. And if you were to point out how he ran his church and how it aligned perfectly with the 12, signs that you're in a cult, he would have said, so I just follow the Bible. And if that's a cult, that's a cult. He didn't care. He was so black and white, narrow-minded, and just blinded. It's like the saying, absolute power corrupts absolute. And I don't know if you've seen the studies that they've done. I'm trying to think. I think it might be Pinker, might be the last name of the author, who did I hope I'm getting it right, because this is a really important book for people to read. But it was, he did a study of basically human evil and how it develops. And evil being termed as, people that just victimize other people, like a cult leader or someone like Hitler, or a political leader or a CEO that takes advantage of the underlings. So what they found was fascinating, that you give the average really sweet, even like the sweet old lady, absolute power without accountability, and they will squash people. It's very fascinating. So I believe that there's something in that psychological dynamic of being in a position of power without accountability that just makes people somehow lose all compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
And
could I ask?
Yeah, go right ahead.
With the people that you're referring to that are in the leadership, where they would maybe admit even that that some of the signs look similar to a cult, they'd obviously tell you, we can't be a cult because we have the true message. So they're just copycats that are cultish because they're following the devil, but we're the real message. Anyone that's kind of got that kind of message, or even just even a real simple message like the Bible says it, that's it. That's the end of it. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. We're done. And there's a sense of being unwilling to see another side to it. There's always this. I've seen it in my own life. There's maybe a sense of we'll listen to you talk about your other side, your other opinion, but you can tell it's really not to listen. It's to kind of entertain or give you the freedom to get something off your chest. It's the freedom to maybe just let you share what you've learned because you feel like it's burning in your chest. I learned this thing, I learned that thing. But at the end of the day, they want you to get done your thoughts, and they really want to get back to the gospel. Like it goes back to, like you said, you are a sinner and you need Christ. And there's this sense of, like, when some of the conversations I have with people, I get the sense that they're not just not listening. I mean, they're not, but it's almost like they can't listen. And I'm torn at times about how hard to take some of those conversations. I honestly lean these days much more heavily to not going into some of those conversations, just because it's like if someone just truly asleep, it's like you're trying to argue with someone it's in a coma. It's like, what good do you really think is going to happen with this conversation? It's not going to go anywhere. And yet I know at the same time that for me, it was some of those other conversations, not necessarily live conversations, but YouTube, videos of watching some of these people that talk through it, like Matt Dillahunty and Christopher Hitchens and other people, Sam Harris, and many other people that talk through the issues, both the philosophical issues of Christianity, but also just the history of the Bible. Where did it come from? What was the history of Yahweh, and the story of Jesus? How did the Gospels come about? And all that information, I would have said, in a sense, I'm blinded. I've got no open ears to listen to the other side, but it did make a difference to me. Ultimately, it slowly planted seeds, and it's really hard for me to turn around and do that for other people, because I feel like they're so closed-minded. Do you have a way that you approach or think through that and strike a balance where you're not, to use their phrase, you're not casting your pearls before swine, but you're not just saying, well, you know what, if you're stuck in this, I'm sorry, but you're stuck. You're in a coma. I can't help you. How do you deal with that balance?
Well, when people come in for RTT therapy or coaching, I'm really careful about stepping on their religion. The only time I will question it is if it's clearly at the root cause of their issue. And then I will explain that to them, and they could take it or leave it. But as far as like day-to-day conversations, I usually have certain logical arguments that I will kind of fall back on. And if they don't respond to that logic or reason at all, then I just don't proceed. And to give an example, one of them that I use frequently when I'm talking to people is I'll say, do you believe that a person that's never heard about Jesus Christ is going to die and go to hell? Most people will say, no, that wouldn't be fair. And I say, okay, most people, except for the hardline fundamentalists, they're going to say, yeah, they're going to hell, but most average people are going to go, no, that really wouldn't be fair. I don't think they would go to hell if they've never heard. And I always use the analogy of, let's say there's a woman in Tibet. She's raised 11 children in poverty, and she's fed the poor, helped her community. She's just a really good, loving grandmother. Now she dies. She never heard about Jesus because all around her, she's surrounded by Buddhism, right? So will God send her to hell for being born in the wrong place at the wrong time? No. Okay. So I say, so let's take the concept of the missionary. Now let's pretend a missionary comes to the Tibetan village and he preaches the gospel to those people. Typically, they will convert 5 to 10% at the most of the general population. So now we have 90% of the people in that village going to hell because they've heard the gospel, and 10% of the people in the village now going to heaven. Now, before the missionary arrived, 100% of the people in the village were going to heaven because they didn't know and they were ignorant. So that makes the missionary an incredibly evil person. And then I just leave that there for them to flounder around with. I'm not trying to deliberately, appear as an intellectual superior. I'm just saying, look at the fallacy of the argument. There's certain things that just don't mesh. And it's very disconcerting. It's very agitating to the nervous system to be in a state of cognitive dissonance. It will cause a massive amount of anxiety in anybody, to believe one thing and then logically look at something completely different and say, okay, my beliefs say this, but I'm seeing clearly with my own two eyes that this is not true. But I'm going to set all of this evidence to the side, and I'm just going to stick with my belief. Now, here the question is, why would anyone do that? Okay. And for most fundamentalists and strict religious people, the answer is they're afraid of hell because they've been taught their whole life, the devil prowls around seeking whom he may devour. And the Satan himself will masquerade as an angel of light. So that individual who seems kind and good, who's coming to you to tell you that your depression and anxiety might be caused by your religious beliefs, is now your mind's going with angel of light, to deceive me, to pull me away, to lead me astray. And you're terrified of the individual right off the bat. I was taught to be terrified of people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris. I remember once having the courage to listen to a Richard Dawkins audio. I don't remember even what it was. I think it was his first book. So I'm listening to this.
God Delusion?
Yes. It made so much sense in so many things he said to say, made so much sense. And I was terrified. I went into such a state of anxiety that I couldn't sleep for 3 weeks. I was a wreck. But my biggest fear was not, maybe my religion is not true. It's, my God, I'm being sucked into the vortex of hell right now, because my mind kept going, this makes sense. This is logical, So when I finally started to leave, it was a slow, drawing out process. When I finally did that, in order for me to have the courage to explore other people's ideas, I kind of saw that what I was believing was toxic. I saw it because my children were suffering. I looked around church and I thought, the fruit of the Spirit is supposed to be love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. I'm not seeing any of that. I'm seeing fear and backstabbing and guilt and shame and anxiety and depression and a lot of stress-related physical illness. I think the pivotal moment for me was getting diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. So, which I struggled with badly for 2 years, and then later for another 3 till I made that full recovery. And I was already eating organic and doing everything right. So I wasn't not taking care of my health. I wasn't overweight. So I'm like, how could I become so ill? And I began to look outside the physical into the world of the mind. And I started to study positive psychology and say, what do people believe who are happy? Because I wasn't. I was told that my anxiety was a result of my sin because I didn't trust God. Well, have you ever read the Old Testament? He's a hard guy to trust because he could strike you dead at the spur of a moment for the slightest infraction, So, Jesus is much more appealing, but he's still, there's still this Old Testament God, and Jesus could be quite scary at times as well, especially if you read the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Where a person who lies is thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity. So it was very difficult for me to trust that God. And if you have anxiety and depression in a typical group like that, they're pointing the finger at you, saying it's a sin problem. Yeah. And you're desperately trying to recover. And everything you're doing to recover, like reading your Bible more frequently, praying more often, is leading you further and further down into the pit, because unfortunately, there's a lot in the Bible that is the polar opposite of what you need to believe to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. People who are mentally and emotionally healthy have core principles that they believe about themselves and the world. People who are not have core principles that they believe. And so I was watching all of this psychological and mental struggle going on in myself, my children, and my church members, and thinking something is wrong. What is it? I wasn't ready to question my beliefs as a whole. So I just started to try to look at small components of it. But I wanted to explore out there, and I was so afraid. What if I'm going to be led astray? Because I'm either A, not really saved, or B, if you don't believe in eternal security, you're led astray and you end up in hell. So either way, bad deal for me, right?
Yep.
So my first order of business was to say, is there really a hell? Once I could reasonably dismantle my belief in hell, I now had the freedom to explore. Even though I still believed in God, I was able at that time to say, okay, I'm not going to be condemned for all eternity to hell because I'm not sure about things, or I don't understand, or I have questions. Imagine a parent who condemned their child to eternal torment because they didn't understand calculus. Trying to explain the calculus. You don't understand it. So you know what? I'm throwing you into the fire and making sure it lasts forever. I mean, it's such a crazy concept when you think about it.
It's interesting that you bring up some things that some of the your story is a little different than mine, or I'm sure everyone's got their story, but some of the things you're touching on are very similar in that I've been thinking a lot about the issue of what do you do when the cognitive dissonance that you're talking about when it comes in, like, because there are ways in which those of us who were in it, myself included, we probably had that cognitive dissonance, but there's ways that we do mitigate it. Like, for example, you talked about the whole salvation, if you never even heard, are you going to hell or not? And I was exposed very heavily to Calvinism, which I know a lot of Baptists are not Calvinistic, but I came from a Baptistic background that morphed my journey into Calvinism. But this idea of, well, it's not just about whether or not that person in the tribe, if they accept or reject God. The reality is that God is electing people from before time began, saying, this person, that person, that person, they're part of the bride of Christ. And, if that person is destined to be one of God's children, he'll find a way to get them to bow their knee to his salvation. And if they're not, then they're condemned already, according to, John, book of John. And so you come up with these, but also I think I noticed, once you escape, you notice more about where you were. You notice that there's a lot of people that they either ignore it, like they just say, you know what, I don't understand God's ways. His ways are mysterious. His ways are far more than my mind can understand. He's the all-knowing, omniscient character. I'm this little peon, this little ant that knows nothing of reality. So clearly, I can't question God. But we also have these issues where we put people up on a pedestal and say, well, you know what, such and such a PhD and an apologist with this great ministry, he has this answer, and I don't really understand it necessarily, but I know that somewhere there's this amazing guy that can read Hebrew backwards and forwards, he knows the original languages, and someone has a great answer for this, and I don't necessarily need to be that person. I don't have to have all these answers. I can trust that God has the answers, and he's given some people in the church the answers. And it's like you just kind of put it on the back burner, and you don't feel like you need to deal with it in various ways, which is, I say that to my shame. We should deal with it, especially the issues you're talking about. You should be willing to deal with the issues of, are you really saying you think someone is going to burn in hell forever for various reasons? And all the Old Testament stuff that you kind of touched on, do you really think it's appropriate for if a child, even an adult child of someone, if they repeatedly are rebellious, that the parents should take the child to the elders of the tribe and stone the child to death there, because that's, in holiness to God? All these questions, and it's like, it's empowering to come to a point where you can say, I have the right to say this is acceptable now. Like it's so hard to be like, because you're always thinking it's God calls the shots. God says it's right. God says it's wrong. God says what's black and white. And to give yourself that freedom to say, I see, like, for example, genocide in the Bible. I see genocide, and I am not comfortable with that. And it's almost like it brings it into, I think, probably some of the stuff that you've talked about in your other videos and you deal with, where people are in sometimes abusive relationships. And if some things happen in an abusive relationship, you'd say, oh, hell no, I'm not accepting that. I'm not okay with that. But somehow we give God this get out of jail free card and say, oh yeah, I can't question the king. He can do this. He can be abusive. He can be psychopathic. And I have to just still call him loving and still love him back. And to give yourself that freedom to say, no, I'm okay saying I am not comfortable with that teaching. I'm not comfortable with that doctrine. I am willing to stand up and say, something's wrong here. Either I misinterpreted the Bible, so I've got a job to do and figure out, did God really say that? Or I give myself the freedom to say, this isn't right. And I tell you, it is so hard to give yourself that freedom. It's like, it feels like you're giving God the middle finger. You're like, God, I'm the judge of you, not you've been the judge of me for all these years, but I'm the judge of you and of your book. Oh, that's hard to do.
Well, interesting that you brought up Calvinism, because I think, this is my own personal opinion, I'm not backing this with research, that's probably the worst Christian doctrine, is the doctrine of election. So you're basically saying God birthed people in onto the earth to deliberately send to hell, and that's okay with me.
Yeah.
Now, if hell was something that you kind of disintegrated, be a little better. But no, I'm going to burn you for all eternity for finite crimes, and you have no free will. Okay. So interestingly enough, I don't know if you've heard this, but after the Great Awakening, we've all in the Christian world heard about the Great Awakening and how we need another one. We need great preachers like Cotton Mather and Charles Wesley and all these people, right? Well, it's interesting, if you actually delve into the non-Christian literature on the Great Awakening, what you'll see is as these preachers came through town, they left behind them a wake of extreme mental illness, okay? Because you would have a certain portion that would determine, based on viewing their lives, that they were part of God's elect, because you were taught to look for these signs that you were part of God's elect. And now you have a certain other portion of the population that's taught, because of your behaviors, you're clearly demonstrating you're not part of God's elect. Now, who is that going to be over here? Okay. It's going to be mostly the people that already are traumatized and suffering with behaviors that were, as we talked about earlier, programmed in through dysfunction, or maybe they had an addicted alcoholic father who spent his time in the saloon or whatever. Okay, so they're going to be more prone to emotional disturbance anyway, right? And so these preachers come through. The people that would decide they were not part of God's elect and were part of the damned would experience so much anxiety and fear that it would overwhelm the nervous system and they would crack up. So if you look at what physicians were writing about the Great Awakening, you will be shocked. The hospitals and mental illness facilities just overflowed. The amount of suicides that people committed.
I believe it.
Unbelievably toxic, because beliefs have consequences.
Yeah, and the arrogance of the people that did kind of fit the description of, I'm an upstanding Christian who loves God, and I didn't sleep around, I didn't steal anything. They suddenly get in this arrogance mode, and it's like it increases the difference even further, and they become the standard for what Christians should look like. And the people that are in it are like, a lot of them are struggling with this facade, like, I'm not really this good person, I really do think evil thoughts, I really do lust or whatever. And then everyone else that can't fit the bill is like, we're screwed. And yeah, I can imagine just across the board between the levels of the passive aggressive arrogance and the despair, it's like, it's a hotbed for all kinds of issues. And it's funny though, when you ask Christians to look at stuff like that, their response is very bland. It's like, what would be my problem with realizing that God loves me? Like, how abusive is it that God loves me? Do you ever get that kind of response from people? They're like, they just don't get what you're describing, and they just kind of sum it up as like, God's loving. He did everything he could to redeem me. He loves me. How is that harmful? What do you say to stuff like that?
It's just like, they're asked to trust that their doctrine is true and that God is loving because the Bible says he's loving. Okay. Despite the fact the Bible says he does very many things that you and I especially would consider very unloving and abusive. If you apply all of these same situations to a parent, take the story of Adam and Eve. Okay. So I use this occasionally, but I'll say, so imagine me as a parent. I have two children, a boy and a girl. And I put them in a room and I fill a big table in that room with fruits and vegetables. And then in the middle of the room, I put a big chocolate cake. And I tell the children, you're only allowed to eat the fruits and vegetables. You are not allowed to eat the tempting chocolate cake. Now, because I'm astute and I already know my children are prone to eating chocolate cake and wanting chocolate cake, I know they're going to eat the chocolate cake. And I also know that once they eat the chocolate cake, I'm going to kill them. Okay. So, and so they eat the chocolate cake. Now I'm very displeased. I punish them, by torturing them until they die or whatever. I can't really come up with a logical equivalent of eternal damnation. Okay. So, I mean, what court of law would not consider you an abusive parent? To deliberately place in front of your children something because you're all knowing that they are going to partake of, and then you could turn around. How can you justify that? And the only solution people will come up with, well, he's God. He can do whatever he wants. You have no right to judge him. Okay, so let's assume that's true. What a scary world we live in. And this is why Christians, fundamentalist Christians, have one of the highest rates of anxiety and mental disturbance. If you are not emotionally and psychologically struggling when you go into a fundamentalist church, and a lot of people are drawn into it because they want certainty. I want to be certain about everything I believe in. There's no one who's more certain than a fundamentalist. They've got it all down and they're going to tell you how it is. And you can be certain, okay, I finally found the truth, right? So they're drawn into that. If they were relatively emotionally healthy getting in, there's no way you're going to spend a significant amount of time there and not be affected on a psychological level. You're told the polar opposite of what you need to believe, what, an emotionally strong, healthy person psychologically believes. It's very much what Marlene Winnell talks about in her book. That was one of the pivotal moments for me. I read the book the first time as a Christian and the second time not, and I was terrified of the book when I was reading it at the same time, thinking, oh my God, this makes so much sense, and if you are to believe that you're broken and defective and sinful and bad, that affects every area of your life. So I actively taught my children that they were broken and bad and sinful and worthless. And that, now here's a scary thing to think about. You're so bad. This is what we teach, in many churches. You're so bad and sinful and wicked that God had to kill his own son because that's how bad you are. You know what I mean? And I would always, this thought would pop in my head. Wow, he's God. We're always emphasizing he's God. He could do what he wants. Couldn't he come up with a better way? Couldn't he?
Can he just forgive? Just say, I forgive you.
Yes. No, and people say, well, the Bible says that blood is required. Well, who made that requirement? If God made the requirement that blood is required, couldn't he change that?
Yeah. I love too the picture you gave of Adam and Eve, and that's the kind of stuff that I feel like it's weird looking back on it that you didn't, as a Christian, you don't think through those issues. There's someone else that does a similar story with Noah. Do you follow the gentleman named Pine Creek Dog at all?
I have not heard of him, no.
He's great. He's a former Mennonite who deconverted after thinking through the issues, and he does a great job of just thinking through all these issues with people and asking them questions until it just kind of unravels. But he said, with Noah, if you had, for example, in current day, this horrible criminal man who had attacked a whole bunch of girls and hurt them and done terrible things, and then he gets caught. They bring him to the court, and the judge condemns him and says, I'm condemning you to death for what you did. And then he looks over to the girls that are there, that testified, and he says, in addition to the criminal being killed, I'm also killing you. And we today would be like, that's horrible. Why would you kill the girls or the victims? And yet in the story of Noah, which I know is not real, but if it had been real, it's like you're talking about little babies, nice old grandmas, babies that just got born, they're still nursing. They're all have to be killed. Like, how are we okay with that story? And yet, and as literal fundamentalist Christians, and yet we were. I I never questioned the narrative. And it's shocking
And
to look
here's
back at it.
the part, we are teaching these stories to our children.
Yeah.
Think about, I think there's a woman online called Lydia Joy. She has a blog. I highly recommend. I think she's the one that wrote this article. And it's about the fear-based world of growing up as a child in fundamentalism. And I didn't, my kids did, and they could tell you stories. But, she did a great job of just showing how the doctrines that she was being taught floated around inside of a child's brain and caused massive anxiety. But if you think about one Bible story, so, God wants to test Abraham's love. So he asked him to take his son up on a mountain and sacrifice him. And of course, God's not really going to have him sacrificed, right? Because he's a loving God. But now imagine this from the perspective of Isaac, okay? So the dad wakes you up and says, come on, we're going to go for a walk. He's got his firewood, he's got his knife. And, if it ended there, maybe it'd be okay, but it doesn't end there. He ties him to the rock and raises the knife over him before God goes, stop, kill the ram instead. Okay. Now, if someone came into any sort of therapy and their father had subjected them to such torture and then said, well, God said that I wasn't supposed to kill him in the end, what social services agency would leave that family intact? Okay. So now we're telling this story. So what are 6 and 7-year-olds in Sunday school thinking when they hear this story? What if God asked my mom and dad to sacrifice me to test their love?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've thought a lot about that story too. And it's interesting, the 2 other aspects of it. Number one, if you hear a voice in your head saying, do something violent, listen to it. Like, how is that an acceptable part of the story? But number 2, they were supposed to be separate from all the people around them, right? And all the other people, I believe, had child sacrifice. I mean, I know historically we know that Israel also had child sacrifice, but if everyone else is doing child sacrifice to Baal or whoever, to their pagan gods, and you want to look completely different, well, when your God tempts you and says, hey, I think you should kill your child, wouldn't the best answer to look so different and unique in the world be to say, of course not? It's amazing how that story is it's horrific on so many levels. And you're right, we teach it to kids.
There's so much more that Christian parents teach to teach your child fundamentalist Christianity is akin to child abuse. I will say that absolutely unequivocally. I was, and it's hard to say, I was a child abusing parent by my religion. It wasn't that I said, I'd wake up in the morning and go, and fundamentalist parents don't. They don't wake up in the morning and go, yeah, you know what? I think I have a child and abuse it and cause psychological damage. Nobody does this. But if your beliefs are harmful, if your child is struggling, and that's why I looked at my kids struggling. I saw myself struggling and I thought something is wrong with this picture. And when you're not so blinded by it's a problem when we're raised a certain way, we're taught a certain way, we're completely blinded. How many people followed Hitler blindly? We have incredible ability to be deceived and to pick our beliefs and believe them despite all contradictory evidence. That's why we have 2 political parties.
Yeah. With the trauma, did you, this going back a little bit to your story, did you get caught up at all in the whole apocalypticism, the end times, the rapture, left behind kind of stuff? Did that become part of your church perspective as they teach that to you, and did that become part of the anxiety of at all? I know some people.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the problem with that is our nervous system is designed to keep us safe and alive and healthy and happy. So when you believe that the world is so incredibly unsafe, and in my church group, and I also spent time in the Mennonite Anabaptist type groups, so I gravitated in and out of different arenas. There's this real teaching that there's going to be terrible persecution of Christians in the end. Okay, so when you go to church, if you knew as a parent right now in America that there were marauding bandits, or terrorist organizations or whatever, you're probably not going to choose to share that information with a 4 and 5-year-old, right?
Right.
Okay, it's your job to protect that child. They don't need to know about AIDS and terrorism and all these things that their little nervous systems are not capable of handling. And yet we sit children in church, we teach them Bible stories, all of these terrifying things that we think we call realities. And we create a fearful universe. So when I left, we were, in the end, I was really isolated as a stay-at-home homeschooling mom. I pretty much was only exposed to mostly people within my church group or other very conservative groups. I did not associate with non-believers. I was taught that those people out there are very bad, evil, they're unhappy, they're wicked, they have orgies, they do all this stuff, they're just horrible people. So, and I believed it. My children were taught that. So when we left, I stopped homeschooling my oldest son, who's now like 23 years old. He just graduated from college. He spent his senior year at a public high school in the country. It was pretty benign compared to a lot of them. It was an absolutely terrifying endeavor for him. Very difficult to adapt. And I think few people that don't come out of that, extreme cultic groups, realize what it's like to re-enter into society after being told everything out there is evil. People want to persecute you. They want to kill you. The world hates you. Children's Services wants to take your children away because you're a Christian. It's just, you go into church and it was like being terrorized Sunday after Sunday, because you might think erroneously during the week that you were a pretty good mother. Well, let me tell you why you're not. Okay, here's where you're failing. Let me give you 5 key points of your failure. Or you might think that you're safe in this world, but let me tell you why Children's Services wants to take your kids, and they're trying to persecute you, and they're all sorts of conspiracy theories and all sorts of stuff.
They're going to hold you down and put 666 on your forehead.
Yes, the mark of the beast is coming. You're not going to take it. You're going to be dead, depending on what dispensation you believed in or whatever. You never, the thing is, I never felt safe. Okay. And then your refuge is supposed to be in the Lord. In the midst of all this chaos, you take refuge in the Lord so you can feel safe. Okay. Can we feel safe? Would you take an abused child, and they come into your home as a foster child and they're afraid. And then, they have to go back to their parent and you tell them, you just need to trust your dad. Yeah, I know he beat the shit out of you and knocked you down the stairs. And I know he's always drunk and he yells at you and screams at you, but now you have to trust him. No one would think to ask an abused wife or an abused child to trust their abuser. Okay. But the God of the Bible is abusive to his constituents. So, and, if you take the Bible literally, word for word, it's the inerrant, infallible word of God. I'm going to take it literally. You have to do something with these stories, and people say, well, that's the Old Testament. There's plenty of stuff in the New Testament as well that, if taken literally, is pretty scary. And I'm not saying there's no beautiful. I have right here, I have a picture, we can't see it, but it says the truth shall set you free. I still believe that, but I will tell my clients, if it doesn't set you free, it's not the truth.
Yeah.
So believing that you're bad and worthless as a woman, and which naturally will morph into you choosing abusive maltreatment as an adult woman in relationships. This does not set you free. So therefore, it's not the truth. I don't care what book it's written in. It's not the truth, So I do believe there are truths, there are things that are true and there are things that are false, pedophilia is bad. It always will be bad. It doesn't matter what culture you're in. Abusing, molesting children is bad. Okay. you know, um, murdering an innocent grandmother and stealing her money is bad. So, you know, to me, you can go the opposite extreme and say there's no absolute truth, and that would not be beneficial, you know. But we're asking an entire the church is asking entire population of people to trust this God and believe this word is inerrant when they can clearly see that it comes completely natural not to trust somebody who displays the sort of behaviors that God supposedly displayed. There's no way you could trust another human being who carries out such evil acts.
Yeah.
You know,
When
and
you I'm sorry, good.
that's all right. Just knowing that if you screw up, you could be punished, or if you just happen to think that you're saved when you're not, and you're always warned every Sunday you might not really be a believer, you know, that in and of itself is terrorizing. They have all your life the threat of eternal damnation. And if you personally believe you're one of the God's elect and that doesn't apply to you, you have people you love that it does apply to.
Yeah, and there's even the sense of even if you are a Christian and you know you're going to make it, there's this sense of you're going to ruin your life. I think in the pastoral epistles, one of them, Timothy or Titus, talks about you can make your life a shipwreck, and the idea that you could get to heaven kind of by the by the skin of your teeth, but you're not really making a difference for the kingdom, and you're kind of going to bow before God, and he's going to say to everybody else, well done, good and faithful servant. But to you, he's going to say, you know, you can come in, but you weren't really a good and faithful servant. And just that shame. And I know for guys especially, the sexual shame of the the purity culture, it's overwhelming. And I remember I've said this before, but I remember Bible college. I switched to Lancaster Bible College in central Pennsylvania after my freshman year at Bob Jones, and I'll always remember this. Only one time I was there, the dean of men called all the guys together. It was like the dining hall, and it was 7 o'clock at night. All the guys had to show up, and I'm thinking it's going to be like a little kind of like a Vespers, a little church service. Hey guys, let's just talk about our passion for God. Let's love God. Let's just build up ourselves. Let's read some Psalms or something. No, the message was, guys, the masturbation has to stop. And I'm not that he knew anybody was doing it, but it was like this implication of I can just guess. I know you all are going back to your dorms and masturbating, and like the shame of your desires. And I know for girls, a lot of it was kind of the opposite of like, guys are stumbling and you're the reason. So it's like you should be ashamed for being such a stumbling block. And that's just sexuality, just one of many little issues. But between the shame culture of sexuality, the shame culture of other issues, it builds up when you even if you get through the issue of hell and you make it, and you're whether you're because you're one of God's elect or because you truly believe, either way, you've got this other whole issue of you've got to stay close to God, and if you don't do enough devotions, you're not close to him. And I know for me personally, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for me, I was a Christian for 43 years. It was entirely real. I know the gospel. I've preached the gospel. I've memorized thousands of verses. Went to Bible college. Blah blah blah. I did not have peace at all, and it shocks me. And I'll say this and move on. But it shocks me that if you tell people, "Hey, I deconverted from Christianity," and they're still in it, they're Christians, they would be horrified, many of them, and they'd want you to please come back quickly. And so you if you were to be upfront with them, you'd say, look, your God had 43 years to fix this, to give me some sense of the joy and the peace of the Lord. I went to Bible college. He could have, if there was some issue where I just didn't understand the gospel well enough, didn't apply it, he could have fixed it with these 30, 40, 50 different amazing professors who taught me all these things about theology, all these sermons, all these great books, living pastors, dead pastors, theologians. God had 10,000 chances to give me some level of peace, and he didn't do it. I'd like to now step away from this unpeaceful life and be, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And I've got other reasons I left. That's not what I left. But if you were to say it that way, they're just like, but you got to come back. You got to come back. And it's very similar to this abusive spouse issue or an abusive parent. It's like, at some point you have to break ties and say, this isn't healthy. I'm not thriving. I've had decades to thrive. I haven't thrived. And I tell people, I had more peace in the first week of deconversion than in 43 years. That says something. That says something to me. And I feel like people need to listen. I know you talked a little bit about, being willing to trust yourself or listen to yourself, your own intuition. And when you say to yourself, something about this isn't right, it's like, you got to give yourself the freedom to listen to that voice a little bit. That's not Satan. That's not some horrible, atheist that just wants to send you to hell. That's your own brain's, triggering and saying, hey, think through this more. There's more to this. And I'm so thankful that the chips fell so that I would give myself that freedom. And I appreciate that you're saying a lot of the same things of saying, do it, think through these issues. There is a different way than this cognitive dissonance. You don't have to stay in it.
Yeah, it's interesting, as we were always promised the peace that passes all understanding. And I strove and strove and strove. No, I prayed, I sought, I tried to increase my faith. I had the entire Sermon on the Mount memorized.
Wow.
Not trying to win my salvation. I was really wanting to be a good servant of God, and people will say now, well, obviously Tiffany was never saved. It's like, okay, that's a convenient answer. But there's not a single day that I don't wake up and go, oh my God, I still see how we still say it, but thank God, that I have this peace now and I'm out of that. The worst day outside of Christian fundamentalism is better than the best day in, for me. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I have peace. Now, does it mean I'm never anxious, never depressed, never upset? No. But words can't even describe what it feels like to be on the other side. And I have that peace because you cannot hold certain beliefs real strongly and have peace. You cannot, just like you cannot ask an abusive woman to have peace when she's having the crap beat out of her, even if her husband is emotionally abusive and he's telling her what a loser she is, and how she's so bad that he has to do this or that. I mean, you would not expect her, nobody in the right mind would say that to her, and so I think the key message I try to get across to people is that our beliefs matter. They have consequences, and you become like the God you serve. And that is why the more fundamentalist the church, the more unloving, uncompassionate, unempathetic, judgmental the people in that church become. And anyone who's even maybe gravitated through and ended up in a different form of Christianity will tell you, spirituality and even belief in God is not necessarily harmful to a person. It depends on, whether you still have those foundational beliefs. Do you believe that you're bad, wicked, evil, defective, and not enough? That's going to have horrendous consequences. We learn now in psychology and in the therapy world that right there is at the root of most mental, emotional, and relationship problems. And that is distinctly what is taught in fundamentalist branches of Christianity.
With your journey, did you get kind of pulled in or attracted to the more liberal kind of Christianity before you actually, deconverted, or what options did you feel like you had on the table besides just not being a Christian anymore?
I explored the heretics. That's what I did. People like what's his first name? Bell is his last. Rob Bell.
Rob Bell, yeah.
Okay, so I read some of his stuff, but interestingly, the book that started, I think that was the pivotal point for me in my questioning. There were like things I would hear prior to that, but when it really came down to where I went, the light switch turned on, was a book by Tony Robbins. Okay, it was just a personal development guide. So the message in this book was, I realized that the people, I read the book and I thought, now if I thought this way, I wouldn't be so miserable. And I would also have different behaviors in my life, like it would mean it's just logic, And I was also now leaving that world enough to I started to go to the YMCA, and I'm talking to other moms and women, and I'm like, these people aren't evil or unhappy. It's weird. You know what I mean? Like everything I was told about them was wrong, and I started to explore liberal Christianity a little bit. And I read books by authors that actually attempted to explain the atrocities of God. One was called The Violence of Scripture, and I can't remember the author. But still, there was a lot that wasn't reasonable or logical. It's like the argument makes no sense to me. Okay, I can't accept it. And I realize that things have to make sense to me at this point. So I wouldn't call myself an atheist now. I would say I'm spiritual. I don't really attach a name to that.
Did you go through a point where you addressed like the issue of the afterlife, and did you feel like you've made any conclusions on whether you think there's somewhere we go when we die?
Yeah, it's weird. I gravitated from liberal Christianity into agnosticism. For a while, I embraced atheism. The ultimate reason I didn't latch and stay there is because of certain experiences I've had that other people haven't had. So, and I have no problem with whatever people believe, as long as it's not toxic and harming other people,
Right.
I'd never, there can be a toxic form of atheism too, if it becomes as dogmatic and judgmental as fundamentalism. I've seen it, and it's scary. So my thing is this a healthy place for an individual to be? Are you harming anyone because you're teaching or believing something? Then it becomes a problem, So for me, I've had certain experiences that it's difficult to chalk up to coincidence, where I felt I was guided and directed. And as far as the Christian view of God, I've completely rejected. So whether I want to call it the universe, energy, I don't know.
Do you think there's anywhere we go when we die?
I lean towards that being true. Okay. Yeah, I believe it is. I don't know where, if we're reincarnated, if, I don't believe in necessarily a heaven, And I really, it's not a big deal to me either way. Either way, if I'm just not there, I won't know it.
Exactly.
So it doesn't bother me either way. So as someone who works in therapy, helping others, when clients come in, I get really strong Christian people who come to see me, who might not after they see this podcast, but I don't question their beliefs. I work with them. What I want them to leave with, my goal is, if you come in and you have terrible anxiety, I'm going to point out where that anxiety is originating. And if it's your religious beliefs, I will tell you, but I don't tell them they need to believe the way I believe. They need to be an atheist, or they need, I say, this is your view of God. And if you view him as your cosmic parent, is your heavenly father, how is that going to affect you? It's the same as your abusive father was, or another abusive father. And sometimes what they choose to do is to cherry pick in a different way, because the way that people can, this sounds really offensive to some people, I know, and I apologize, but the way that you can read the Bible and not be damaged by those negative things is to cherry pick the positive out. And there's a lot of good stuff in there. If you view the Bible as any other spiritual text, a good example of that is Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, which happens to be probably my favorite book of all times. And it's sort of a very Zen book, but I would say he believes in God, and that doesn't offend me. He uses the word God, that doesn't offend me, because he has a healthy spirituality. So I encourage my clients, if you want to adopt a healthy spirituality, be my guest, but you need to learn to recognize toxic spirituality, because it will affect every area of your life. And there's some research, and I wish I could tell you who did it, but I know I've seen it. The rate of divorce and relationship failure within the fundamentalist community and within evangelicalism primarily is actually higher than in the general population. Now, how could that be when divorce brings with it such shame? It's, there could be many reasons. Some people say, well, it's because the church draws in people that are already troubled. Okay, you give them that. But I will tell you, that some of the ideas they have about, you mentioned earlier, sexuality, and the idea of the husband as the head of the wife, removing equality from the equation and making an authoritarian arrangement, are very toxic to relationships, and very damaging. And I saw most of the women that I was in contact with were very unhappy wives. The ones that weren't, their husbands really weren't taking their proper biblical role as the head of the household, I think we have to look closely at what we believe.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting point, though. The whole idea of people being unhappy. I have a lot of friends and family who are, as far as I can tell, exceptionally happy in Christianity, and they still see it as the best way to live. And I'm often not torn per se. I know that it's mythology. I mean, to me that's what it comes down to, is it healthy or not? Even if it was healthy, it's mythology, so you're lying to people. But even if you feel like it's healthy, it's been interesting to see the dynamics, because there are certain groups that people get into, and especially in the Calvinistic world, there are Calvinistic sub-pockets that I'm very exposed to and very much still in contact with, where if you do it their way, they will help you to thrive. They'll help you to raise kids in this Christian community that's very sheltered, but a lot of them are very reasonably healthy, and they try to really make it just a little bastion of God's kingdom on earth. And if you get in the right group and the right clique and the right way at the right time, it can feel somewhat healthy. And I feel like the hardest part for me when I see that and to swallow that pill is just what they're doing to kids. Like, I have no problem with people saying, I feel like the best life is to live for Jesus Christ. Fine, but it never, like, the sentence never stops there. It's always, I need to live my best life for Christ, let him live through me, and let the gospel permeate my mind. But I need to teach my kids this. And for me, no matter how happy people might be in Christianity or theism, it breaks my heart to think, kind of like I go back to the Matrix movie a lot, but in the Matrix, Neo, they pull him out of the pod, and they're trying to repair his body, and he opens his eyes in the bright lights. He's like, "Why are my eyes hurt?" And they say, "Because you've never used them before." And I feel so burdened for people where they spend their whole lives, for some of them from birth to death, with this whole umbrella of Yahweh and Jesus and the blood magic and the scapegoating and the future kingdom. It's about Christ is coming back, and they never ever get to actually open their eyes for 1 minute and see reality as it is. And I almost sometimes get brought to tears thinking about the kids and how it's I think Marlene Winnell, you mentioned her name, but she uses the word preying on kids, like PREY, preying on them. And like you mentioned before, telling kids, that Jesus did this for you. Like, when you physically see that picture of, like, here's the statue of, the crown of thorns and the blood running down and the nails piercing his hands, his feet, and the cut in his side. And then they tell you, to a kid who's already hypersensitive to pain, where they're like, if their friend falls off the bike and scrapes their knee, they run, "Oh, can I help you? And let me go get your mommy," whatever. They know what pain is, and they want to help. That's innate. So this innate sensitivity and innocence, and then you paint this grotesque picture of this man that's in so much pain, and you say, you put him there. You add it all up, and it breaks my heart. And I feel like that's why I feel like I can't not speak. Like, I have to do something. I know I can't, I mean, you can't get into some of these people's worlds. They're very sheltered, but like for the people that are willing to click, or they're willing to listen to a podcast here or there, it's like put something out there so that when they do finally click, they're like, yeah, you know what? There's a different side of this life. I don't necessarily have the whole picture. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, just to use their phrase, but I would love to see the next generation start to drift away from some of, especially at least the toxic parts, if not all the way, but at least get rid of this. You agree with me and you bow your knee before Jesus Christ, or you're burning in hell. At least get that stuff out. I think I'll accept step one. Let's at least be a little bit happier as humans. We'll work on the other stuff over time, but I do hope that message is clear to people. They're hurting kids.
I think we're seeing that. Like I've noticed, now this is just in my homeschooling community, but if you look at the children of all the families that I lived in, a lot of them are like, hell no, I am not adopting this lifestyle. And the minute I get free and break free, and it's because of the misery that was subjected on them. Now, there are some good Christian families that are very loving. There are some good Christian people who are loving and compassionate people. And I think that when we leave, we got to be careful we don't gravitate to the other extreme. We were in one extreme. Now we're going to gravitate to the other extreme and think everyone who's a Christian is a flaming evil idiot. That's not true. There's some really good people. Yes. And it all really depends on what the focus is. The last church I attended, for the most part, I thought people attending this church are getting a pretty healthy dose of healthy spirituality. God was portrayed as loving, someone who helps you through your problems, someone who guides you, with wisdom. You could trust him. They weren't preaching on and emphasizing all of those difficult passages. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, if you talk to the average Christian and you say, do you know in the Bible, you'll say, well, what I don't get, I'll say to somebody is, like the laws, some of the laws. If you beat your slave and he dies on the first or second day, that's murder. If he dies on the third day, it's not murder. How is that good? And the whole concept of slavery, what's that? Next, or what about if your husband is in a battle and you decide to take up arms and defend him because he's clearly losing, maybe the battle's in your own tent, you accidentally touch the private parts of the opposing enemy. Now, you are very guilty, and you either put to death or your hand was cut off. I can't remember.
Yep.
What is that? Loving and kind, and they go, that's not in the Bible. And I'll say it is. They will stand their ground, stomp their feet. That's not in the Bible until I can pull it out and show it to them. They have never heard it, and they've never read that book from cover to cover. And they have no idea some of the things that are even in there because they're blind to those things. And they only see what the emphasis is at the church they're being taught. And that's why they can live a pretty happy, decent life.
Yeah, I know we're almost out of time, but could I ask one question? I'd love to take more time with it, but I did want to at least ask it before we wrap up. When you were deconverting, or when you were thinking through it all, maybe you didn't know it was going to end in deconversion, but when you're thinking through the issues, did you end up stumbling into sort of the more researchy, just the factual parts of like where the Yahweh character evolved from, the whole idea that, that there was other people in that area in Canaan and so forth, where they already believed in El, and he had a son named Yahweh, and there was a god, the consort wife named Asherah, and that, Yahweh had eventually became merged, and Yahweh had Asherah as his consort, and eventually Asherah got taken out of the story, but it kind of just kept on evolving. But they began as a polytheistic group, and then they became henotheistic, then monotheistic, and then eventually, as you kind of track it through, that there's a whole story that you don't get told, like how Zoroastrianism affected Christianity, that that the idea that there's like 40-50 different gospels that were written, and we got 4 of them, but there's a lot more, there's dozens more. Just how early church history affected it, how they copied, how Luke and Acts are a copy of Homer's works, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how they're clearly woven into the Acts. How a lot of it looks like, John and Jesus are or the John the Baptist and Jesus, or from the Essene and Pharisaical communities. There's argumentations back and forth between those subgroups of Judaism. Just all this historical stuff, and even just the basic pagan parallels, like Jesus looks just like, this God and this God in this way. There's not copies, but parallels where he looks like Mithras a lot. He looks like Dionysius a lot. Did you get into some of that more, just factual stuff about the origins of Christianity?
Not everything that you mentioned, but some things. Like in my liberal Christian stage, I was looking a lot at I'm drawing a blank. The meeting that was held to decide what the canon of scripture would be.
Nicaea.
Okay, yeah, the Council of Nicaea. So it's interesting for me at that time, exploring liberal Christianity and away from fundamentalism, that most of the people at that meeting would be considered blaring heretics by any evangelical church today. There was a striking amount of people that actually believed in universal salvation. So, and it was interesting that they couldn't decide back then what the hell the truth was,
Yep.
And I did hear Richard Carrier. I don't know if you know who he is. He's written a number of books. I did hear him speak, and I got to have dinner with him.
That's awesome.
I've explored things like that. Most of my exploration, I think, was centered on trying to figure out why I was so damn miserable and unhappy, and the fact that I had 6 kids didn't leave me, the amount of reading I actually got done was stunning. But interestingly too, it's interesting also to note that some of the early church fathers held books in canon that we would be mortified by, like the book of Enoch. You want to be freaked out, read the book of Enoch. It's basically a terrifying saga that reminds me of Dante's Inferno. Maybe that's where he got the idea.
Well, it's interesting. Most Christians don't know that book is quoted dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times in the New Testament. It's not just in Jude, it's all over.
So clearly, all the apostles considered the book of Enoch to be part of scripture, and yet it was rejected at the Council of Nicaea.
And a huge chunk of the Christians of the world in Africa, they never lost Enoch. They've always had it as part of their canon. It's amazing to think about. It's like there's always been a lot of Christianities from very, very, very early on, and it's never stopped. And somehow we think, oh, we've got this one pure version. It's like, no, you don't. It's just always people arguing about what the truth is.
No, and they didn't. And even in the early church, right at the onset, there was arguing. And if you look I did this comparison. I was always wanted to have the full truth. I really wanted to know God and understand him. And I wasn't sure, is the predestination in Calvinistic theology right? Or do we have eternal security like the Baptists teach, or do we not, like the Mennonites teach, right? Okay. Not being born into a certain church, I had to pick my own. And so I did a comparison of all the Bible verses. This is how I was really a student of the Bible. All the Bible verses that support Calvinism and predestination. All the Bible verses that support eternal security, and all the verses that support you can lose your salvation. Eternal security came up on the low end of the totem pole, with the Mennonites coming in second and the Calvinists clearly coming in first for scriptural support. And then you're left with standing face to face with the Calvinist God, which is a scary dude. Okay. He just created little cute babies to throw them in hell, and, but the fact that there was so much disagreement is astounding. And I'll tell you an interesting story real quick. I was in the sauna at the local gym, and I was still a Christian at the time. And I was talking with a woman in there. I said, "What do you do for a living?" She said, "I run an inpatient therapy program for people with mental illness who live in this home in this town where she runs this program." And I said, "Oh, interesting." And I was starting to explore things. So I was explaining to her how I learned that certain religious beliefs seem to be directly correlated with mental issues. And she went, "Yes." She goes, "The most mentally ill of my patients usually are the most religious. And it's not a God loves me and he helps me and guides me and I pray to him for emotional support. No, this is I've got to please this angry deity in the sky view, and I'm never good enough, you know. So that's what their minds are emphasizing, you know, where somebody else, you know, another church might emphasize love and respect and community service. Yeah. And the people in that church won't be too damaged, you know. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, if all of these churches are going to the same book to get the source of their information, why is one church ending up emphasizing love and another ending up emphasizing the scary stuff, the fear, the guilt, the shame? And I heard an interview with Nathan Phelps, Fred Phelps of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church. He was being interviewed, and the interviewer was clearly probably a man of religious faith. So he said to Nathan, he said, you know, it's amazing to me that your dad could read the Bible and become such a cruel person. You know, I mean, I don't understand how that could happen. And he looked at the guy and said, my dad was a student of the Bible. And basically the reason why he became the person he is because he took it more seriously, more literally, and followed it more closely. I'm not using his exact words than other people did. He did not cherry pick out the nice stuff. He followed all of it. Yeah. You know, if you follow all of it, you're going to become a horrible person unless you can find a way to twist these things. I mean, verses say what they say. You know, there's no way you can take the story of Abraham and Isaac and not make it a traumatic experience for Isaac, or the story of the man who promised to sacrifice the first person that came out of his door. Yep. And then he does it. You know what I mean? It's like nobody intervened there, you know, or, you know, we lack wives. Let's go and, you know, ask the prophet what to do. Well, go over here and kill all the men and take these women back and make them your wives. Well, that's not traumatic. You know what I'm saying? There's you know, you have to set that stuff out and refuse to think about it. If you think about it because you're people that have a brain like me or you that can't ignore stuff, who really want to know the truth, it makes it very difficult. It's not impossible.
The only consolation I have with some of that stuff is I know a lot of it, you know, I'm sure you do too, that a lot of it wasn't real in the sense it wasn't historical. There's been no archaeological evidence for huge amounts of it. And, you know, it does give me consolation, but the fact that they believe it happened and it's okay that it happened that way because God said to is very troubling. And I have a lot.
It sets you up for a lot of other problems. It sets you up. I mean, this is how the kings of old ruled with such fury, because we have the divine right of kings. There is an ultimate authority who can abuse people, and it's okay. So then why is the king wrong if he wants to do it for the greater good?
Yeah. You know? Yeah. The ramifications of this worldview are endless. Well, I know we're short on time, but I definitely appreciate your story. I had a few other questions I wanted to ask. Maybe we can do it again sometime. But for anyone who again is not already connected with Tiffani Cappello, I'll have some links beneath our video if you want to you know, do a little bit more digging and connecting with what she does. A lot of good stuff. I've seen several of her videos. I'm going to be watching more. She has great things to say. Please go listen to all the things that she's been doing. And Tiffany, I just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you for what you're doing. Your voice in this is amazing. It's very clear. I love the clarity and the you touch on a lot of subjects, but it's like you go in and you say it powerfully, and you go to the next subject, and it's like you're hitting on all this, you know, firing on all cylinders, hitting all the subjects that we need to be talking about. And you bring it, you boil it down very, very clearly to, this is harmful. This is not, we're not thriving. We're not healthy. Let's get healthy. So thank you for doing that. And I just appreciate you and what you're doing. So hope to connect with you again as well sometime.
Sure thing. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.